Welcome back. As promised, I'm joined now by Allie Fontana, one of our fantasy football gurus and one of my favorite people in the world. So as you guys know, I've been trying to bring back some of my personal favorites, and so I'm so happy that Allie was able to join me today. We had a few little hiccups trying to get hooked up, but we're here now. And Allie, thanks again for joining me.
Well, it's great to be back and awesome to talk to you. You know, we talked earlier in the season.
Yeah.
And here we are in Week 16, Championship Week.
Yeah.
So it flew by. I don't know really where the time went.
I don't either. Really, the season went by very fast, kind of like the blink of an eye. And I was talking, I did 2 interviews for today's show, talking with my other guest, Natasha Paul. I was really shocked that I've got 2 teams, actually, that I didn't realize my Yahoo team had made the playoffs because I wasn't getting notifications, but it did. It was a pretty good team, and but my main NFL female team made it, so I'm kind of happy. I've got 2 teams in the playoffs this weekend.
Well, that's awesome, and, you know, It's been quite a journey. I saw in several leagues that I'm in, you know, very competitive leagues. Mm-hmm. In a few of them, there were some runaway kind of teams or teams that were consistently good. I managed in one league despite losing Le'Veon Bell, Arian Foster, Mark Ingram, Keenan Allen, Big Ben for stretches, Tyler Eifert for stretches, etc. Plus some, you know, backup bench type people that went out on injured reserve or were injured to make it to the semifinals in Week 15 and nearly kind of made it to the finals. I mean, you know, my running backs, I always draft deep at running back, and I went through every one of them, you know.
Oh, yeah?
It took Mark Ingram longer than maybe some thought. So it's just been, when you look at the list of players that are on injured reserve,
it's crazy.
You know, it's mind-blowing. So I'm glad to hear that you're in the playoffs in 2 of your leagues, and hopefully you can help some other people in Week 16.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it is. It has been. The last 2 seasons, really, for me, have been interesting fantasy-wise. I have not checked I just made a conscious decision at the beginning of the season not to check my MFL teams until the end of the year. They're, as Allie knows, they're auction teams, and I'm fairly new to the auction game. And so I haven't checked them. Of course, you don't set your lineup in that, but I had 6 teams where you do set your lineup, and one of them is it's an IDP Dynasty League, and I exceeded the number of slots available, which is 5 to IR players. I can't even I have 2 guys. Steve Smith is one, and there's another one that I can't even IR. I had Jamal Charles, Le'Veon Bell, Arian Foster, Kelvin Benjamin, and I forget. May have to look that up real quick. I forget this guy. So, yeah, you know, the injury aspect, I think you and I have talked about this before. The injury aspect really, it's kind of starting to eat away into my enjoyment of the game. I hate to say that, but it just is. And I have not yet seen the movie Concussion. I do intend to see it. And you know, I just, you know, with the Chris Borland stuff, you just wonder, you know, I think that football is always going to be around, but you wonder what the future does hold for the game.
Yes, you certainly do. I mean, I saw a news program the other day where they talked about there are 10,000 fewer sort of high school or high school kids playing football this year than I think the previous year, or there's some kind of statistic they talked about, just saying about, you know, parents being concerned about these injuries, and football isn't the only game. I have one nephew that played competitive hockey for you know, since he was 5 years old, and he had multiple concussions, and one that he had lasted, he had symptoms for months, so he kind of had to give up he made a choice himself that he would, you know, give up the competitive hockey and just kind of play occasionally for fun, you know, grabbing some ice time. So it's not just football, but you certainly have to wonder, you know, and as much as you can be frustrated about the injury, I think the more frustrating part is just players and we had so many of them who underperformed this year. Or in some cases it was, not solely the player's fault. You could look at usage in certain systems like a Lamar Miller. I mean, some inexplicable usage of a guy who, when you watch his game film this year, looked really, really good. Even Doug Martin, who's, I think, the third running back in standard league scoring in terms of fantasy points, but even he's been used at times maddeningly inconsistently by, Lovie Smith and the Buccaneers. So, I mean, there's some crazy things that, and then you get into all the busts like, Eddie Lacy, C.J. Anderson, the list goes on.
I didn't have Eddie Lacy, but I definitely had C.J. Anderson and Jeremy Hill. I consider Jeremy Hill a bust.
He is a bust. I mean, you would absolutely say that because where he was drafted and how he performed. And, again, some of these players, had a spell or two where they performed or he had, a multiple touchdown game. But, when you draft some of these players in your first couple of rounds, you are expecting, unless they are injured, that they are going to be people that you start without thinking about it. And you can't say that, well, just because I drafted him in the second round, I'm going to use him without giving it some thought, because the week-to-week consistency just wasn't there among some of these players. And in some cases, these guys battled some injuries. Even if they didn't miss time or significant amounts of time, they weren't fully healthy. Or, I do think in the case of the running backs in Denver, it was more than just their individual play. It was, the Peyton Manning situation, kind of a square peg in the round hole kind of system thing and all of that. So anyway, but nevertheless, they're busts for us because, where guys, when you look at how maybe you won or your won or lost record and the points that you lost in a given week, if C.J. Anderson even getting, 10 to 12 points, you would have been happy. Getting 2, that could be the margin of difference in any given week. So I saw a lot of 7 and 6 type teams going into the playoff leagues where there were tons of people with those kind of records because, different people had different configurations of these players that didn't perform consistently from one week to the next.
Yeah, it's been, you mentioned the Peyton Manning situation, kind of big news. Listen, it's always tough to watch the greats try to play beyond their time. And, you saw Peyton's decline at the end of last season, and he came back for one. I thought it was a mistake to come back for one more year. And definitely the system isn't friendly to him. The Broncos just announced today that there are questions how healthy he is, and he has been all year. But they're going to stick with Brock Osweiler, I think, for the rest of the year, regardless of Peyton's situation. So, I don't know whether that change. C.J. Anderson kind of, I don't know what his health status is. I've moved on from him, but do you think that changes the outlook for Broncos players?
Well, I mean, I think for them, we saw players being used. I mean, Brock Osweiler, I think that it looks like we won't see Peyton Manning back in Denver in 2016, whether he decides he's playing or not. So they need to get Brock Osweiler as much experience as possible. We've seen that he's not unafraid to throw the ball. He's, Demaryius Thomas, in some cases, he's been a bit of a disappointment.
He has been. I have him on one of my teams. He definitely has been. He dropped far too many balls.
Right, he gets the targets, but he's not fighting for the ball sometimes. And you think if you drafted him in round 1 or early round 2, that kind of ticks you off, to see, because the effort doesn't always look like it's forthcoming there. I don't think that, the thing is, if C.J. Anderson was fully healthy, I don't see anything that Ronnie Hillman's done in recent weeks that would preclude C.J. Anderson from, getting more touches or anything. But at this point, it's week 16, so we need to really look and say, if you're in a 1-week playoff, I know some people on ESPN, you play in those 2-round playoffs thing for your championship. Right. So, but if you're in a one-and-done week this week, I mean, I'm not looking to put C.J. Anderson in my lineup. And frankly, if I can help it, I'm not putting Ronnie Hillman in either. I mean, but we've had so many injuries, and again, we've had some people that, while they may not be on an injury report like a Chris Ivory, he's kind of taken a step back in recent weeks, and you have a guy like Bilal Powell who stepped up. And, actually, our friend Matt Riddle on Twitter, we used to joke because we played into leagues together and were drafted a lot of Bilal Powell in like the 15th, 16th round of drafts in the past, and we always joked about him. But, he was unhealthy for a large part of the early season, and now he's a guy that, I'm going to start Bilal Powell in a couple of leagues this week. And, you have to look at touches and what they're doing with those touches. And I don't care that I picked him up off the waiver wire. He's a guy that's producing. So I think we have to kind of divorce ourselves from players that if they have a good matchup and they don't, but they're not getting touches or they're not performing even with a good matchup, unless you're truly desperate, you need to forget about them and go with somebody who, has been getting it done, particularly in the last stretch of, 3-4 weeks. This is, that's our recency. That's what we have to go on, not somebody who might be good just because the matchup's good.
Yeah, Bilal Powell's interesting. I had drafted him in the later rounds of the Scotty Fishbowl League, and actually played him one week because my roster was such a disaster. That's a deep league, and as the season went on, I had several Packers wide receivers, and of course, I had Jordy Nelson and Devontae Adams, and even Ty Montgomery. And so toward the end of the season, I was forced to I think I dropped him and had to pick somebody else up. And now, well, of course, now I'm not in. I've made a round or two, but I'm out of it now. And so, you look at it now and you're like, wow, why would you do that? But when you've got guys that are injured, sometimes you're forced to make those decisions, and doesn't necessarily always turn out for you. Let's talk a little bit about about how to win your fantasy football championship. What strategies you recommend? Of course, we're going to talk about starts and sits and working the waiver wire too.
Well, again, at this point, if you're in a 1 week, hopefully you've constructed a lineup that you're comfortable with, that you rolled with hopefully last week. Last week was a killer for a lot of people, with some other folks going down on it with injuries and all of that. So you're looking for, if you have a solid team with people that have been consistent performers, I don't think you change your strategy. If you look at the person, a lot of times, you look at who you're competing against. Sometimes we may be playing a team that's, looks on paper to be stronger, or conversely not as strong as ours. And so you try to see, do I need to go with the upside play there just to give me some juice, as opposed to somebody who might get me 8 to 10 points. And conversely, sometimes we want to be a little bit safer. So, as I said, I'm looking for situations this week where I think you have to look at how the player's been performing, what the matchup's like, go back and look at how many looks or touches are they getting, targets. Even with a drop, look how I'd rather play Ted Ginn, for example, and some other players that were drafted probably early to middle rounds just based on performing. I sat in week 15 in one of my leagues. I sat Calvin Johnson, and decided to play, Michael Floyd. Michael Floyd could have had a better game, but still he got me more points than the 2 points I would have had from, Calvin Johnson. So I just think you have to look and see, is the player, he's not healthy, he's a glorified decoy, so you don't make rash judgments. A lot of people in Week 15 had fielded a lot of Bryce Brown questions. And my feeling was he's very talented, but it would be sort of a risk to roll with him in Week 15. Yes, he could go off, but he could also get you, 5 or 6 points. So, and what we saw was, and that whole situation was very complicated. So still you have Kristen Michael, Bryce Brown, Derek Coleman, and Fred Jackson. I prefer not to use any of them.
Yeah, really.
But if you have to use one, I'd probably say use Kristen Michael because we saw him get some work. But just know that if you're in a 2-week playoff situation and you used Bryce Brown last week and he didn't come through, I wouldn't necessarily drop him because Pete Carroll said this week is going to be, the hot hand kind of approach. I'm not playing either Lamar Miller. It makes me kind of sad to say that, or, Eddie Lacy. That's definitely over any bit of sadness with Lacy. I'd rather play, for example, Cameron Artis-Payne, or if Denard Robinson is healthy and gets a start, people that are going to get touches. You can't possibly understand what they're doing with Lamar Miller in Florida, in Miami with his usage. So I'd kind of look for players that are maybe going to get a little more work if you really need to go that route. It's even quarterbacks. You may be able to find somebody that can get you a better return than Aaron Rodgers. I mean, he's not killing you if you have an overall sound team, but you have to really look for who's going to get me the points to pull out this win. So, and now we've seen players like, it's hard in our minds to reconcile would I really use Kirk Cousins over Aaron Rodgers, but look at Kirk Cousins' stat line.
I think I would.
Right.
Yeah, it could. I joke around on Twitter a lot. People take me too seriously at times, but Kirk Cousins has played pretty solid this year. I don't know that he's getting he's getting some recognition in some circles. Aaron Rodgers, on the other hand, overall, his season's been a big disappointment.
It has, and you can attribute some of that, obviously, to, I think, not Jordy Nelson. The loss of Jordy Nelson kind of set that in motion, I think. And then none of the other receivers, when James Jones was first signed with the team, he was kind of that dump-off guy, the trusted receiver.
Yeah.
But he can't be the guy, the only guy that you have. Plus, they didn't have the running game going. The O-line wasn't great early on. There were lots of issues there. So, it just hasn't been the season for these huge games.
And he's been off too. Some of the responsibility falls on. And I love the guy. Listen, he was one of my quarterbacks. Get this, Allie, you'll appreciate this. In the Scotty Fishbowl League, I drafted Aaron Rodgers, Teddy Bridgewater. Gosh, that was kind of a disappointment for the better part of the year. But one of my late round flyers, Brock Osweiler, and I held on to him. I did. I held on to him, and I've played him played him toward the end of the season when he started starting. Yeah,
he's a guy now. If you used him last week, you were rewarded for, from a fantasy standpoint. I'm not as high on him this week. In a 2-quarterback league, if you're starting to, or you can flex the quarterback, you might take his floor as opposed to some other random person you might flex. Because generally quarterbacks, work pretty well. But there have been some exceptions this year, where they were getting 5 or 6 points themselves. So I don't love him against Cincinnati this week, but in other weeks, and I completely agree with you that there has been, some weeks where you're like, wow, Aaron Rodgers is not finishing, where not delivering the return that perhaps people expected when they drafted him. So, and I think this season, I preach this all the time. I don't take quarterbacks early. Okay, an exception might be in a 2-quarterback league, right, where you're required because you need to have somebody that you can build. You need to have somebody that you can start with confidence every week. But I just think the value, 5 of the top 6 quarterbacks in fantasy so far this year were not drafted early. The only one was really being Cam Newton, and he wasn't even that early.
No, I picked up most of my more successful teams this year, and I rode Cam Newton all the way to the championship in my NFL female league. I was getting Cam in like the 12th to the 15th round because people just weren't believing in him, and I was picking him up, at a good spot too. There were very few quarterbacks I would have been willing to do that. Aaron Rodgers was one of them, but he just always got selected before, I was taking other guys, or he was already selected. So the only league I got him in was the Scotty Fishbowl League. I think that if you did wait and you picked up a Cam Newton or even a Tyrod Taylor, like later on, or you could even pick him up off waivers in a lot of leagues.
Right. He's still, because, he kind of had a tale of 2 seasons. He had, I think, 3 early season games where he, was 20-plus fantasy points in a game. Then he had an injury, missed some time. When he came back initially, it wasn't good. His production was low, and then he kind of got on another stretch where he was putting up some numbers, and then he kind of had an average game, and then last week he stepped up in a big way. But, for somebody, if they're rushing, what we did get from Cam this year is more rushing than he had last year, which kind of soured people on him last year. And you're right, he was a great value this year. And then we also saw when Kelvin Benjamin was injured, the whole season's been he's got no one to throw to. Yes, Ted Ginn's going to make some drops, but he's also going to get a boatload of targets.
Well, he's been a fantasy stud this year.
He is. Now, I'm not sure that again, I think you have to evaluate a player when Benjamin comes back. Is he going to be the same guy he was? We saw, though, that Ted Ginn, in a situation, became serviceable. He is very fast, and Cam's passing has also improved this year. You can't look at his completion ratio and blame it all on him when, you have, Ted Ginn dropping a number of balls in a game. Funchess really wasn't ready for prime time.
He really wasn't.
So there's been a lot of that. But overall, you have to be really impressed and happy if you did draft Cam as your backup or you picked him up off of waiver wires. He had his worst game of the year was week 1, and in ESPN standard scoring, he had 12 points. And outside of the 13-point effort in Philadelphia midway through the season, he's been, 20-plus fantasy points. He's not really getting fewer than 17 or 18 points a week, and then many weeks he exceeded that. So you have to be happy with that, and especially because it's very difficult to trust people. Carson Palmer was another quarterback that was great value. He was a QB2. I drafted him sometimes as my first quarterback in like the 11th round or something, and then sort of loaded up. So if you do that, people want to believe that you have to take that quarterback early, and you really don't. Every year, those of us in the fantasy, analysis business say that it's just not necessary. And when you look at the performers, Fitzpatrick this year You know, he's come Kirk Cousins. It seems like he's being well coached by Gruden. You can see some development there, which, you know, gives you a little more confidence using him.
He's got some fantastic players around him too. Let's not forget that. Jordan Reed, you know, the injury issues are concerning. The concussion history is concerning, but he's a fantastic player. You know, Pierre Garçon, maybe one of the most underrated wide receivers in the league. Deshaun Jackson's had some great games. I mean, he's got some legitimate talent around him.
Yes, and also some of the, you know, his protection on the O-line has been better. So, I mean, the whole thing, it's just, again, that NFC East has been a bit of, you know, a mess this year, you know, with underperformers all around and, you know, many players not living up to expectations. They're frustrating, running back by committee situations. I mean, that's what we've seen. So when you talk about winning your championship, I mean, I think you go with the trusted people that you've used, because if you made it to Week 16, you've done something right. You've been using the right players, because oftentimes, you know, I've been playing 15 or 16 years, and I found myself this, you know, the year on occasion, you know, maybe trying to get too cute or overthinking something, like tweaking the lineup at the last minute and then kicking myself later. So
I know.
So go with the players that you know, that you trust. And again, if you've been riddled by injury, you aren't. It's not going to be something like if you said, you know, oh, am I really going to use Christine Michael or, you know, in Week 16 for my championship? Well, maybe you have to. So, you know, depending, and then also if you're in a deeper league, then some of these other players, like I mentioned, a Cameron Artis-Payne, he becomes sort of somebody that I like, you know, if Jonathan Stewart is sitting out again, and it looks like he will. So, you know, he doesn't have a ton of upside, but if you're, you know, you need somebody for an RB2 situation, he might be a guy that I look for. And, you know, in the past we used to say flex, most of the time it's better to flex your RBs just because of touches, et cetera. But you really can't, that's not as hard and fast this year because of all these committee situations. So if you have a receiver that's like, somebody asked me, would you pick up Kristen Michael or, you know, Ted Ginn? And I said, well, if it's just for the championships in Week 16 and you want to flex play, I think the floor of Kristen Michael might be decent, but I'd play probably the upside of Ted Ginn. Cam takes deep shots to him a couple times a game. The targets have been there most weeks. He scored 6 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, close to 300 yards receiving, and, you know, I think 16 or 17 catches, maybe a little more. I need to look at those numbers. But so it's there. So you just have to kind of look at where do you get your advantage and take some reasoned risks, but don't start a player. Like, I mean, I wouldn't feel good about Shane Vereen, for example. He had a bigger game last week. They finally used him and Rashad Jennings. But it's kind of scary to go into a championship with some of these players, because if you look at Vereen's game log over the season, he's had a big week here and there, and then he disappears. And that's really Tom Coughlin and, you know, the coaching decisions there, the game plan decisions there.
Yeah, I agree with that, too. Let's go ahead, excuse me, and just talk about, we've probably touched upon some of them, but who would you name as your fantasy studs and fantasy duds for 2015?
Well, you know, we can, the studs, as we've talked about, you know, clearly, you know, Cam would be a stud, although he was, you know, his behavior this past weekend was kind of, you know, not kind of, was very immature. You have to say that Odell Beckham has been, even when Eli hasn't been playing very well, you know, he had a 5 or 6 game stretch of 100 yards or more in a game, touchdown. So he was doing his, you know, fantasy job for you. You know, we've had some unexpected studs. come up like some of these, for a period of time. Devonta Freeman was either a waiver wire gem or a stud. He's really kind of fallen off a cliff, which I know one of the things we were going to talk about later was how you draft in 2016. So I would say that if you're in a keeper league or something like that and you picked up Freeman off the waiver wire or took him in the 12th or 13th round, that's not a bad thing. He's definitely somebody to consider keeping. But I don't know that I'd take him in the first round.
What do you make of Kevin Coleman? What are your thoughts on him? Well,
again, he was. I always say that it's very difficult with these rookies to kind of peg. They were both injured heading into the season, so we didn't see a lot of either of them. He got healthier first and got his shot. I think it's probably better for him to learn a little bit more, kind of get his feet wet. Freeman is really, I think his strength is really as a pass catcher, and we saw that this year.
He's kind of what they wanted Jaquise Rogers to be.
Correct, exactly. He's probably a better version of that. There's maybe more talent there, et cetera. But I don't see that next year he's just going to be the guy and Kevin Coleman's just sitting there on the sidelines waiting for his opportunity. Yeah. Of course, that'll depend on camp and health and all of that kind of thing. So what I'm saying is that you really need to kind of keep some of these guys in context. D'Angelo Williams has been a guy that, came off the bench, so to speak. First we saw him in those weeks where Bell was suspended and then post-injury for Bell. And he's been a guy that was really great value and somebody, because I'm looking at the return, on investment. David Johnson's an interesting guy because, he was scoring touchdowns even when he wasn't getting very many touches early in the season. And he was on a bunch of my rosters. And then because I needed somebody, I sustained injuries like so many, I dropped him. And, I wasn't lucky enough to get him back in seasonal leagues in any league. But he's a guy that, could really help you in fantasy championships. I looked at some of the results last week, and so many people had David Johnson on their teams. I mean, he made up a significant portion of somebody's fantasy results. I think when healthy, LaShawn McCoy really delivered for fantasy owners. I mean, sadly, he's been sort of riddled with injuries. Yeah. But, he's definitely a guy that came through. Obviously, you have the Antonio Brown, Allen Robinson, a little bit forgotten. It's a crime that he wasn't, nominated
I love that guy.
To the Pro Bowl.
Is.
Second-year guy, 69 catches for 1,141 yards and 13 touchdowns. He's somebody that you could really count on most weeks. I mean, he'll have his moments. And, some of that is Bortles has been interesting because he puts up fantasy numbers, but if you go back and watch the game films, it's very ugly at times. He's been fortunate that sometimes the opposing defense hasn't made all the interceptions that they could have possibly made. He only has 14. Honestly, if you watch the film, he could have double that. But, from a fantasy standpoint, a guy that you picked up off the waiver wires with 31 touchdowns, I think that puts him, he's actually fourth in passing touchdowns behind Brady, Cam, Carson Palmer. So, Russell Wilson was another guy. I misspoke. It was Russell Wilson was a guy who was kind of drafted early.
I was seeing him going between 4 and 7.
Right. Russell was the guy. It wasn't Cam. Cam went later. It was Russell Wilson was the only guy because, Tom Brady, a lot of people took him as their second quarterback or took him late because of Deflategate and his, whether he would be available or not.
Right.
Phillip Rivers was, a stud for a long stretch of time. They did hit a wall there in San Diego with the injuries out the wazoo, both on the offensive line, losing Keenan Allen.
That was huge.
Yeah, so, there's just been some things there that, kind of affected his system, but his consistency later. But, we saw last week he was capable of putting up another big game. So, I like him. As far as tight ends go, Greg Olsen was one of the, I think he was maybe the second tight end behind Gronk drafted this year, and he's come through 71, 1048, and 7 touchdowns this year. So he certainly earned his place, an unsung and undervalued guy. We always talk about him on Twitter, Delaney Walker.
Well, I love, my mad love for Delaney.
So, we saw, Jimmy Graham was a huge bust for fantasy owners.
Yeah.
I wasn't very high on him just because of where you had to take him. If I was going to take a flyer on, if I wanted to get somebody stud-like, I typically went for Tyler Eifert, who was available kind of in the 9th or 10th round. And then I also had some Kelsey. Now, he's definitely a disappointment, probably less to do with his own ability and more to do with just the system that he's in. Just the 4 touchdowns, a guy like that, you would hope that he'd be used more in the red zone. But nevertheless, the tight end situation, as we say year after year, is kind of a revolving door for many of us. So, you kind of go across and you look, and we talked about so many of the sort of bust running backs this year. We might be surprised that Darren McFadden right now is probably, I think he's in the top 15 in standard scoring. He probably have a bump up in PPR there. Would I expect that to continue in 2016? Well, we'll figure that Dallas will do something about their backfield, so maybe not. Mark Ingram was a great value and very consistent for a long stretch. It's a shame that, he went down with the injury, and he was a better PPR play. We used to say, he's good in standard scoring, but he's actually had 50 catches for 405 yards this year, which is, a much higher total than he ever had. And then they never did anything with C.J. Spiller. So if you drafted C.J. Spiller, and I remember him going in the 5th and 6th round, he's never a guy that I owned on any fantasy team. Just never did.
I was big on him a few years ago, and then it really went down. I don't own him either, didn't even look his way this year. I want to back up to something that you said earlier and get your thoughts on San Diego. Obviously, a lot of turmoil surrounding that team. Phillip Rivers, really a disappointing season for him. But Melvin Gordon, I still think he is going to be a good running back in this league, but definitely a rocky rookie season. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I have real aversion to writing people off after one season.
Yeah.
And especially a rookie season. It just seems so unfair to do that to a player. It just really not a good thing for sorry about that. Not a good thing, Gordon. I am a firm believer that a player like Melvin Gordon, we've seen many people put unrealistic expectations on a rookie running back or rookie players of any ilk. We need to allow players to develop. I did think we saw at times a glimpse of the talent. I think that, sometimes the situation just doesn't work. As I said, there were other issues in San Diego. Their O-line was just decimated with injury. Very, very difficult.
It really was.
So, he's not a guy that I would stay off of for sure. There was nothing that we saw from him, I think, that would make you say, stay away. It could make him a better value next year because people, will kind of be soured a little. There's, some of that kind of thinking. But No, I think that Melvin Gordon has a bright future. I wouldn't write him off after one season. And we've seen this with many talented players in the past where they struggle the first year. Sometimes it's just growing pains, and then other times it's just some things that are outside of their control that make it not the season that we sometimes expect.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Fantastic talent. Still really like him a lot. I didn't mean to get you off your game, but I definitely wanted to get your thoughts on Melvin Gordon. I want to ask you about being a woman on social media. That's a topic that I definitely want to talk to you about. But before we get there, survival techniques for fantasy football losers, of which I consider myself one, because out of 6 teams where I had to set my lineup, only 2 made the playoffs. So what do you recommend, survival techniques for fantasy football losers? And then we're going to talk about preparing for next year's draft.
Well, okay. I mean, I think it depends. Some people, they want to stay in the game. So if you haven't been soured by the earlier scandal with, the DraftKings or FanDuel type thing, that's a great way to scratch your itch through the playoffs. That's a lot of fun, and you get to pick your lineup or join a playoff fantasy league. I'm in a couple of them. There are sometimes different rules as to how they work. I actually play in a couple IDP offense combo leagues. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And that's sort of fun. And usually you have, like a maximum amount of time you can use a player is twice. So you have to be very strategic about how you use your starts and things like that, and then sort of picking players as they kind of proceed. You sort of have to have a sense of what teams you see advancing, et cetera. So they're kind of fun. I'm also playing Pat Mayo from Roto Experts. He does this. I do not watch this Bachelor show, but last year I'm playing in this fantasy Bachelor league.
Oh yeah.
And the only thing I did was I watched some kind of like one show and then read some bio stuff on these women who are the contestants. And this year he's changed the rules. This year we're doing like a salary cap thing, and you have to pick. So you basically construct a team. Last year it was like, there were 3 tiers of women, and you kind of had to have somebody in each. I think we did two in each tier. And then there's a site that actually creates all these points for every time somebody says, I'm not here to make friends, you get so many points. And so it's kind of a fun thing, and I'm going to do it again this year because, like I said, I don't watch the show. I pick the team. Once you set the lineup, it's kind of like DFS or not DFS. It's kind of like an ML10 or something, or an ML50, where you just kind of set the lineup and then you see how they progress. And it was a great deal of fun. So, I mean, that's my kind of thing. If you want to stay in some sort of fantasy thing, I think DFS or a playoff fantasy league is a good way to scratch that itch. It's kind of like, we go through withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people just get ticked off and want to just forget about it, and they're angry. But, I think it's fun to kind of wean yourself off of it. And honestly, I'm religiously doing rankings this year for Fantasy Pros, and that is so stressful to get all of those players right. I mean, I know that there's people that can probably have some great system, but, doing that for 17 weeks, plus, I did the pre-draft rankings and all that. So by the time the season ends, I'm kind of happy to take a little bit of break from, thinking about that.
I am too. I take a break. When all else fails, when in doubt, just drink. That's my suggestion.
Right.
So when do you start preparing for your upcoming fantasy drafts, and what strategies do you utilize?
Okay, well, I mean, here's the thing. If I was as a fantasy analyst, I usually give myself, after the Super Bowl, I kind of chill for a month or so. I don't think about it. But, it is important for the work that I do and many others, that you kind of pay attention to off-season moves. And, because you'll see the draft, you'll see free agency, all that kind of thing. So I think for like the, competitive but sort of your average / competitive fantasy player, really until sort of training camp starts, I wouldn't do too much unless you happen to play, like while we were in the Fish Bowl, and of course we had that draft in early July. So it depends.
I don't like early drafts. Of course, I would do. Listen. Don't think I haven't been sucking up to Scotty. Scotty, if you're listening out there, yes, honey, I'm sucking up to you because I want back. But yeah, early drafts, I'm not going to do very many, or I did a lot of them this year. I don't like them. I don't like doing drafts until the preseason starts.
Yeah, I mean, if you play in a lot of leagues, it's hard to do that. And we did in the Fish Bowl, in fairness. I mean, everybody drafted. We all drafted at the same time, and we don't have the waiver wire until after the first week. In some leagues, they'll allow you to go to the waiver wire before, particularly, if you have been hit by injuries. But so I mean, I think it depends. I like to start, if I was sort of, a fantasy player and I wasn't playing in, 20 leagues or something, because trying to do all of those drafts, there were times, not so much this year because I did cut back my season-long league commitment, but in past, having a couple drafts a day in that run-up to this first week, and that's just too much. It's crazy. So, I think it's just paying attention, to what's going on off-season, what the transactions were. Many people, subscribe to different sites, pay sites. There are so many quality sites out there. There's also a lot of free information which you can, avail yourself of. And, I think that it's just important to kind of get the lay, understand as a player. For example, if I talked about Lamar Miller earlier. Now, he's a free agent this year.
Okay.
And
it's kind of weird that Miami waited so long to give him that opportunity.
Yes, I mean, Joe Philbin, so they get rid of Joe Philbin. They have, Dan Campbell. He comes out of the gate running more, using Miller. They have success, and then he goes away from it. So the thing is, if Lamar Miller re-signs with Miami, you have the Jay Ajayi. He's there. How confident are you going to be to, draft Lamar Miller when you're wondering if it's really truly a committee there? If he signs with somebody like Dallas, that could be an interesting move. And then, you'll have to weigh how early in the draft is he going to go if he lands in a plum spot like that. I mean, let's look at what happened with DeMarco Murray this year.
Yeah.
Here he was the leading rusher last year, goes to Philadelphia, everybody's excited. But, oh, wait, they also signed Ryan Matthews, and they had Darren Sproles, and it became, a huge mess.
Philly is a mess. That's the perfect word for Philly, mess. Hot mess.
It is. I mean, so like I said, you can, it's just sort of, if you're interested, if you're a draftnik, if you want to follow off season, certainly you can do that on Twitter. And, just through your reading. But I think serious business gets down. And a lot of people put down sort of magazines as opposed to everything that's available on the Internet. As a writer, it's such a great feeling to write something for a magazine. And a lot of those, some of the content in the magazines, they kind of sum up a lot of things that happened off season for you, coaching changes, system changes, all those kind of things. So you can digest that kind of information and then use your online, the Internet to kind of get the latest stuff that's happened. But so I think the combination of those things and just, sort of paying attention. But remember, I think it's always good to do a post-mortem on what went right and wrong with your fantasy teams this year. Were you too high on, some people, you always have regrets about somebody you cut too soon. Who was it? Why did you cut them?
Do you have a biggest regret Do you have one?
Yeah, I kind of do, because I drafted Jonathan Stewart in a couple of leagues, maybe my either second or third running back, and early on it was he wasn't really
doing anything.
He wasn't doing anything, and I cut him maybe during the bye. I think Carolina had like around a 5th week bye, a bye in week 5, and after that bye. He started to just pick up. He was getting 20-plus touches a game. He was getting scoring opportunities. And so he was the guy that I, in 2 leagues I cut because I had other, situations to contend with. But I think that was like one regret, one guy, especially when you look at how many underachievers we had in the running back category. So, I didn't cut him in week 1 or 2, but I still wish I hadn't dropped him, because in 2 leagues I had so many injuries to my running back core, and he stayed healthy through week up until week 14. So that was kind of like one of those things. So I think it's really, like I said, important to take stock of what went right and wrong with your fantasy teams, what you maybe, like I said, if you were burned by certain things that you did, not everything's in our control. Obviously, we can't predict as much as you say you can predict injuries. You really can't. I also would say that look for players. Again, some people drafted all these, like Amir Abdullah. I mean, okay, well, he's a good example of something that happened last year. He's had he flashed big time in a preseason game. And then suddenly, where he was being drafted in the 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th round, he started going in the 3rd and 4th round in fantasy drafts. You could not use Amir Abdullah for most of the season. Like if you're drafting a player in, the 3rd or 4th or 5th round, you're drafting that player to be in your lineup every week.
Yeah.
You're not drafting somebody to occasionally put in your lineup. And we saw again that the Lions had a lot of issues. Again, they canned an offensive coordinator. They really couldn't get a ground game going for a very long time. And now he got a little more juice toward the end of the season. So you have to be aware of like the hype that surrounds the preseason, and where we draft players, you're probably better off, again, looking for somebody that who can perform for you from the get-go. If you did draft Todd Gurley, some people took him in the 5th round. You had to wait for a while. He did perform. He slowed down for a period of time because he's just been a god-awful offense. But, we saw he kind of returned to fantasy goodness last week for owners. And if you're, again, in a keeper league or a dynasty league, you should feel pretty good about that. So I think those are the kind of things where you're just looking for. You need players in those first 7 rounds, 8 rounds that are going to come through for you. So it's okay to take a risk on an upside play, but, if you look at some of the players, Charles Johnson was drafted in the 5th, 6th, 7th round. He did nothing.
I had to move on from him. Lord have mercy.
Right. I mean, it's been crazy. There are a lot of players, like you could look and you'd say, who? Did I really do that? And, I mean, even somebody like, a Jordan Matthews, he flashed last year. He had the makings of a good player in a good system, and then we saw this year he had hand problems, dropping a lot of passes. There was just something. There was just something system-wise. Sam Bradford coming back multiple seasons from season-ending injuries and really kind of landing and playing almost a full season. He did have I think at least missed 1 game, maybe 2. We saw Sanchez, but what I'm saying is that chemistry does have to happen. I mean, he really didn't play very much in the preseason. He had 1 big game, and everybody drafted him thinking, he was going to be a great upside play. Well, occasionally he was all right, but most of the time you'll look back and say that wasn't a great pick. So
yeah. I didn't necessarily. I wasn't. Sometimes sophomore slumps happen, and
right.
I wasn't as surprised about Jordan Matthews as I was surprised about the number of people who were drafting the other guy. His name
Nelson
is
Aguilar.
Yes.
Nelson Aguilar. Absolutely.
I couldn't believe his ADP.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I didn't own a share of him because I wasn't going to be taking him that early. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, sophomore slumps can happen, but I think even if you allow for the sophomore slump, you kind of expected a little more. I mean, the other thing I have to point out, last year we had Reggie Wayne re-signing with the Colts, and people were drafting him as a wide receiver too, and he did nothing. This year, we had the exact same thing with Andre Johnson.
Yes. Oh, I got bit by Andre Johnson. Ugh. And not in the good way.
No. So the thing is that just because because if you looked at Andre Johnson in his last season in Houston, he wasn't the same guy that he had been.
He wasn't, but you thought that a better well, in all fairness.
Yes, you did. You did. You were not alone.
Andrew Luck stunk it up, buddy. I mean, come on.
Yeah, even prior to his, multiple injuries, he was having a big issue, bad decisions, again, some bad O-line issues, et cetera, but he wasn't making good issues, and maybe there was some other injury that we really didn't know about going on there. He might not have been completely healthy, but he had his slump. But I guess my point is that just because a player goes to a new system doesn't mean that they're going to kind of reclaim their fountain of youth. Now, we saw somebody, as I mentioned, like a D'Angelo Williams, who looked better than he had in years. He looked rejuvenated. He had birth. So I'm not an ageist by any means. I mean, I think that's one of the most ridiculous things in fantasy. Because somebody's an age. But I'm looking at skill set and kind of what your eyes don't lie. And so what I'm saying is if some other player decides to play another, a 30-something receiver goes to another team, if you've seen their skills degrading in their last team just because they are changing to a, quote, better team or what we perceive as a better system, that doesn't mean they will. So I wouldn't have an issue if you wanted to pick up Andre Johnson as, a fourth receiver or a bench guy, but if you're using a second-round pick, and I used to have people ask me, I said, well, I wouldn't start him. Oh, but I really wanted, you mean to tell me I shouldn't start him? And it's I wouldn't. I mean, if you feel comfortable with it, go for it, but it wouldn't be starting. And then people kind of see, he had that one sort of revenge game against the Texans, and then he kind of disappeared again.
Yeah, it was a disappointing season, no doubt. It does look like he's done. It's really, really sad. Allie, I wanted to talk to you about being a woman on social media, but I've kept you far too long, and time is just simply not. I hope you'll come back after the first of the year. We're definitely going to be doing, be more regular about the podcast. Allie knows the situation that I was in, and I'm so thankful I was able to get her on before the end of the year. Tell everybody out there where they can find you, find your work.
Okay, well, you can find me on Twitter at Allie Fontana. I'm also contributing to thefantasyfix.com and Fighting Chance Fantasy this season. So, as I said, I enjoy the times that we get to do.
I do,
I get to be a guest on your show, and
I enjoy it so much.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's hard to believe the season's over, but it's kind of fun to do like I said, to kind of do a post-mortem on the season after you've kind of looked at everything and awards.
We'll have to
and
do that. Yeah, we'll have to do that.
It would be fun.
I hope you'll come back on and we'll talk about stuff other than you're obviously you're such a great fantasy football source, such a great knowledge there, but I hope we'll talk about some other stuff too. And we've done that before in the past. We've been fortunate to have you on. Vashti and I have been fortunate to have you on our show, and we've talked about some other things. And I hope we'll get an opportunity to do that. I wish you and yours a very wonderful Christmas and a happy holidays.
Thank you. I wish it right back to you as well. And to your listeners, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and all the best in 2016 and in week 16 and hopefully your fantasy championships.
Yeah, from your mouth, you know where.
Exactly.
Thanks. All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Goodbye, Sharona.